Excuse me. Good morning. Sorry, good afternoon. Miss Ayesha, you just went muted. Your voice disappeared just now.
Sir, you can start the lecture.
Okay, thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me in this occasion. First of all, I'd like to thank um, Indonesian Embassy in Islamabad, Pakistan, for inviting me, and also I'd love uh, to meet with you online, uh, um, colleagues and students from Bahria University. Um, so once again, thank you. Today, I would like to share with you um, about the Indonesian economy. So about Indonesia from the economic point of view, and as mentioned by Aisha, the topic is about Indonesia, how Indonesia survived from turbulent multidimensional crisis. So the outline of my presentations today can be divided into three subtopics. So the first one, I'd like to present the brief overview of Indonesian economy. I think that's the foundation, which is important for you to know. And then the second one, which is the main point of this presentation, is about the history of and economic policy, the history of, sorry, history of crisis in economic policy in Indonesia. And then the third part is actually about the key challenges for Indonesia ahead. So now let me start with the brief overview of Indonesian economy. So the first thing that is important to highlight is that now Indonesia is the world's top 15 economy in the world. And we are now part of the G20 countries, along with other developed and developing countries in the world. And if that's based on the gross domestic product, nominal gross domestic product. But if we rank these countries by gross domestic product by purchasing power parity, then Indonesian rank is even higher, which is comes at 7th in the world. And Indonesia is located in Southeast Asia, of course, and in Southeast Asia Indonesia is considered as Southeast Asian economic giant. And now the economy, the gross domestic product, has reached over 1 trillion US dollars. Or if we just compare with Pakistan, it's nearly 4 times of Pakistan's GDP. So that's the overall economy, the gross domestic product. And the second one that I'd like to share is also about the level of welfare, which can be one of them assessed or identified by gross national income per capita, based on the categorizations of the World Bank. So right now, Indonesia is in the upper middle income category. So Indonesia has actually reached the upper middle income class since 2019. But then, as we all know, since 2020, and for a few years, we experienced a global COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. And since 2020, Indonesia then downgrade to lower in middle income. And then, but recently, especially this year, Indonesia has re-entered the upper middle income class. So that's based on the gross national income per capita category. At this point, meaning that in terms of the overall welfare based on gross national income per capita, Indonesia still below other peer countries like China, Malaysia, and not to mention Korea that has reached the high income category. But Indonesia is better if we compare with India, which is still until today classified as lower middle income country. And again, if we're talking about welfare conditions in Indonesia, based on the poverty rates, actually, since the last 20 or 30 years, Indonesia has succeeded in cutting the poverty rates since the 1998 economic crisis, which I will explain later. There was about 18 million people, sorry, there was about over 40 million people living under the poverty rate. But then, since then until today, there has been 18 million people has been helped to upgrade and has been helped to exit from the poverty. And then, but again, of the period of over 20 years, we experienced the pandemic crisis recently. And as a result, there was about 2 million people has plunged into the poverty recently. So right now, there are about 26 million people still live under the poverty, below the poverty line in Indonesia, out of the total population of 270. And structurally, Indonesia's economy is still dependent on commodities. So that's why Indonesia has been famous as the world's #1 producers and exporters of palm oil and also natural rubber. And apart from that, Indonesia is also a main exporter, still the main exporter of oil and gas and coal, which is part of the important energy. Coal, Indonesia is the second largest after Australia, and Indonesia is also the main exporters of other commodities, minerals like gold, copper, and nickel. But besides commodities, Indonesia has also, in several decades, in the last several decades, have also developed the manufacturing industry, the processing industries, and the main manufacturing industries in Indonesia, ranging between the labor-intensive industry up to the high-tech industry. So starting from footwear, textile, but we also produce stainless steel from nickel ore. And then we have been one of the main producers of motorcycles and motor cars, the second largest in Southeast Asia after Thailand. And apart from that, the services sectors, Indonesia is also famous of its natural beauty. So that's why tourism industry is also has been developing very fast. And one of the famous tourist spots in Indonesia is Bali, which is quite well known. But actually, there has been an increasingly popular tourism spots in Indonesia all over the regions, like as you can see in this picture. So apart from Bali, there's also some tourist spots in Java and also outside Java. But most of these tourist attractions is actually well dependent or the comparative advantage is actually the natural beauty and also culture. So that's just the brief overview of the Indonesian economy. So now let's move on to the main topics. The main parts is actually the history of crisis and economic policy in Indonesia. So if I'd like to explain this in a chronological order. So since the Indonesian independence, a day in 1945, we have experienced several crises. So the main ones, I'd like to explain about 3 to 5 crises that we have experienced. So the first one is the political crisis happened in the 1960s, which is the first regime in Indonesia, during the first regime in Indonesia. And then the second crisis we experienced is a post-oil boom crisis in 1983 to 1985, which is during the second regime of the presidency of the national leaders in Indonesia. And then the quite famous crisis that happened in 1997 to 98, the Asian economic crisis that mostly hit the East Asian and Southeast Asian nations back then. And then there's also another crisis, which is which is called the global financial crisis, GFC, in 2008. That it was mainly hit the developed countries like the United States. And then recently, in the past 3 years, is the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, now let's move on to the first milestone, which is the political and economic crisis in the 1960s. So the first regime in Indonesia after the independence is actually Indonesia is led by the first president Sukarno, and the regime is usually called the Old Order regime. So during these periods, Indonesia actually experienced the conditions in Indonesia, the political conditions is quite unstable. So there was a political instability after Indonesian independence because many regions in Indonesia still wants to rebel from the United Indonesian countries, that is Indonesia, we call it NKRI. So there are some dissatisfactions from different regions, especially outside Java, because Java is considered as the center of Indonesian development, and many regional leaders outside Java saw that the economic development is concentrated only in Java. So there has been quite intensive rebellions outside Java. And in addition to that, there is also the government, the central government. The Sukarno regime also has a political ambition. A few of that we know is actually the first one, like Dwi Kora. Dwi Kora is actually the move of the Indonesian government, of the regime, to occupy or to annex the neighboring country Malaysia, because Malaysia is considered as the puppets of the Western colonial countries, especially United Kingdom in this case. And there's also Trikora. Trikora is actually a move to not to take over, but actually to take back the West Papua, that based on the law or the agreement, it has to be part of Indonesia. But the Dutch didn't give the West Papua until 1960s, and then there is a move from the regime to fight for West Papua's freedoms.
Excuse me, sorry to interrupt you, sir. Can you please share the slides?
Yes. Oh, share. Oh, sorry. Okay, I forgot to share the slides, right? Right. Oh, it's actually quite a few slides already. I'm sorry for that. Okay. Okay. I'd like to share with you the previous ones just for a glance. I'm so sorry. So this is the ones that I have mentioned before. Indonesian poverty rate, export commodities, manufacturing industry, tourism industry, and then this is the main part, history of crisis and economic policy in Indonesia. And this is the milestones of crisis that I have mentioned. And this is the ones that I just recently explained. So this is during the first president's administrations, which is Sukarno. So in general, there has been unstable political conditions during this period. So and then because of this instability, the government has to allocate a disproportionately large military spending to tackle instability. And then in terms of the political systems, the Indonesian government then Indonesia adopt the liberal democracy during the 1949 until 1957. So there was a multi-party system, And because of these systems, it was very difficult to reach consensus and implement a development program. So it did not only affect the political conditions, but also the development program or economic dimension. And there was also a quick change in cabinet, 7 times during the period of only 7 to 8 years back then. And in terms of economy, there was lack of sound economic policy. The government indeed built infrastructure but there was more like ambitious infrastructures. And apart from that, there, as I mentioned, also large military spending, and that has led to a serious fiscal deficit. And in 1965, as the consequence, there has been foreign debt reaching about 25% of the Indonesian gross domestic product. And one of the main characteristics during this era is also a political intervention to monetary policy. So because of these large fiscal deficits, so Indonesia or the central bank was forced to print money to cover the fiscal deficit. So as the repercussions, in 1965, there was a hyperinflation and also stagflation. So the inflation back then reached 594%. That was really very, very high inflation compared to, for example, this year or recently, just below 3%. And food price increases, extremely, like 260 times in a very short time. So that's why there has been food and basic needs scarcity during this period. And well, poverty, spread all over the countries. Extreme poverty is very, very, very rampant. And then in terms of the currency, rupiah, Indonesian currency, the government also, or the central bank had to cut the notes, which is called in economy is centering, because of these difficulties and the very high inflation. And as a result, there was a political turmoil that has led to a regime change. So in 1965, there was a coup, and in 1966, Sukarno was replaced by the new president, and then also the new regime, which is the second president was Suharto. And the regime was called New Order Regime. That is from 1966 to 1998. So learning from the experience of the older regime or during the Sukarno regime, so Suharto put priorities on 3 things, which is called development trilogy. First, political stability. So he underlined the importance, very crucially, very important political stability, because during the older regime, there is a massive political instability all over the country. And then the second aspect is high economic growth. So this regime really put high priority on development, especially boosting economic growth. And apart from boosting economic growth, the government also tried to distribute the economy. So putting priority also on economic equality. So there was the more sound economic policy. The government, there was well-planned economic development. There was annual 5-yearly and even long-term 30 years of development plan initiated by Suharto's administration. And the government also allowed foreign direct investment, because previously during the Sukarno regime, the government tends to anti-foreign investments, and now during and then afterwards, the Suharto allowed more foreign direct investments to boost economic development, and and as such, there was massive also natural resource extraction and massive development of the manufacturing sector during this period. But in 1980s, Indonesia is basically still heavily dependent on oil. We are one of the largest exporter of oil. in the 1980s. So that's why after the sharp decline of oil prices in 1983, Indonesia, which is heavily dependent on oil, had a crisis or hit by the crisis, which is called the post-oil boom crisis. But during this period, some of the important characteristics also that apart from allowing foreign direct investment, Indonesia is also open in terms of international trade. And the direction of economic policy is open and export oriented. So, for example, in 1996, there are more manufacturing products exported by Indonesia, which is a sharp increase if we compare to during the about 1981, there was only about 5% of Indonesian exports is manufacturing products. And then also the government tried to keep inflation under control. Food was stable and very cheap during the period. And also the energy prices, they're high subsidy by the government. And then there was also physical infrastructure development as well. And Indonesia is also considered as one of the new Asian tigers, along with Malaysia and Thailand. But then the construction of the new order regime, the new order economy was struck or was destroyed during 1996 and 1998 by the so-called Asian economic crisis. So this particular crisis was mainly actually unprecedented because Indonesian economy was, well, characterized by high economic growth, even during the early 1997, the same year of or the initial year of the economic crisis. So high economic growth, fiscal, the experience a high surplus in fiscal, but then it was hit by the crisis, which is originated by other Asian countries, starting in Thailand, and then Korea, and then, well, Malaysia and Indonesia. So there was a stagflation as well in this period in 1998. Economy contracted about 13%, which is the lowest record of economy or of GDP or GDP growth along the Indonesian history. And this economic contraction was coupled with high inflation, up to 78%. To keep the story short, so the investor was panicking, and then there was a capital outflow of foreign exchange reserves declined, which is forcing the Central Bank of Indonesia to release the exchange rates. So the Central Bank of Indonesia changed the exchange rates policy from fixed exchange rates to floating exchange rates. And then there was also the rapid fall of currency, rupiah, about 80%, from 2,000 rupiah per US dollar in 1996 or early 1997 to 16,000 per US dollars in 1998. And as the consequence of the fall of rupiah, there was an increase in private sector's debts that with respect to US dollars, and many of the private firms had to go bankrupt back then. And unemployment increasing everywhere, poverty increasing also all over the country, and these conditions was exacerbated by the crony capitalisms, by the political systems that they're still dependent on or characterized by corruptive and cronyism during the New Order regime. So again, in 1998, because of the crisis, there was a political turmoil that led once again the regime change. So the crisis has also forced Suharto, the second president, to step down. And then the IMF came to the rescue. The IMF intervened by providing 110 billion US dollars aid with conditions that Indonesia has conduct financial sector restructuring, economic liberalizations, has to lower import tariffs. Indonesia had to increase taxations and cut public spending. Indonesia, the governments also need to increase interest rates. Central bank has to be independent from political interventions. There is also the force to privatize the state-owned enterprises, and also some of the important policies during this era is actually the decentralizations or decentralized system of governance from the centralized system to decentralized, and democratizations where the president and the legislative members also need to or can be elected directly by the people. So after 1998, the political systems and economic systems has changed, which is called the reform era. That is also called the post-Suharto era. So since then, there were about 4 to 5 presidents following the Suharto during this reform era. So as I mentioned, the political system is more democratized, governance system decentralized, and as part of the reform is also the establishment of the so-called KPK, which is corruption eradication commissions. So there has been since then stronger corruption eradications. But at the same time, having said that, from the economic point of view, there was a slower recovery, especially during the early period of 2000s, the early period of reform era. The GDP used to grow above 7% during the Suharto era, but during this era, GDP only grew at a lower rate below 5% until 2007. But there is a more sound economic policy if we look at, for example, in terms of reducing vulnerability, because the foreign exchange reserves increased during this era, and the government debts also can be reduced. Financial system was more stabilized, and there is a more intense supervisions of the banking sector, because it learns from the experience of the Asian economic crisis 1998. And in addition to that, the economy, the trade is also more, the economy is more liberalized, leading to, even though it has led to a slower industrial growth. So the industrial growth during this era was slower compared to the New Order regime. And spending for education, human resource development has also increased. And there was an introduction to the so-called social protection scheme and direct cash transfers during this reform era. So this is one of the features of the economy that has mentioned, which is the decentralized system or regional autonomy. So after the fall of Suharto, in 1999, there's a big bang decentralizations. So Indonesia has transformed from one of the most centralized country to one of the most decentralized countries in the world. And some experts like Aspinall and Feely, the political economic experts, say that Indonesia experiences one of the most radical decentralization in the world, because it decentralized from the central directly to district and city or municipality government, so bypassing the provincial government. But in later development in 2004, there was a strengthening in the provincial government authority. Okay, and then this is what has mentioned also before, the corruption eradication commissions. So during the Suharto era, the corrupt practices was actually considered as something normal, or something that quote by quote legal, even though it's not legal. But since the establishment of the Corruption Eradication Commission, there has been cautiousness of civil servants to get involved in activities associated with corruption. So the government officials were more alert and wary of taking the position of, for example, project manager in their own office, and also wary of lucrative positions that used to be very attractive for public servants during the New Order era. And there has also been a gradual decline in the level of corruption in Indonesia, despite the fact that Indonesia is still categorized as corrupt countries until today. And public support for this commission, for KPK, has increased, and public opinion has changed to become less permissive corruption, especially when compared to the New Order era. Nonetheless, Indonesia's corruption perception index has been declining in recent years. So this is the very new development in the past 5 years. And then it's also important to note that about human resource development, because during this reform era, the government introduced a law on national education system, whereas there's this obligation to allocate minimum budget for education, 25% of total government budgets. That's for at least the national levels government budgets. So the central government has to allocate 20% of expenditure for education. So this is one of the important milestone, and there's also an introduction of 9-year compulsory education policy during this era. But then again, after the reform era, in 2008 and 2009, there was a global financial crisis, as we know. And then, but this time, Indonesia is more resilient. And Indonesia is mentioned as, or among a few Asian countries with positive economic growth during the global financial crisis, while many other countries experienced a contraction in economic growth during this crisis. Indonesia still grew positively at the rate of 4% in 2008. There was more stable economic conditions during this period, a relatively resilient financial sector, especially banking. The real sector was not heavily affected or not significantly affected by the crisis. Well, the system and the policy has been more prepared prepared for crisis. So there is a more sound economic policy. And but at the same time, Indonesia typically is also quite it's not as open as other peer countries in Southeast Asia. We have relatively lower exposure to banks compared to the United Nations, United States, Japan, or European countries. We also have lower export share to GDP compared to other Asian countries, and we also have relatively lower integration to global and regional value chain compared to other Asian countries. Now we have come to this administrations by the latest president, Joko Widodo, since 2004. So one of the main feature of the current administrations is actually the priority, heavy priority on infrastructure. So there has been massive infrastructure development since 2004. So we have built many infrastructure projects. There has been hundreds of mega infrastructure projects, toll roads, high-speed railway, and also airport, seaport, and a dam, and also we also built a quite attractive and a big, large cross-border posts in some important borders that we have with Malaysia and also with Papua New Guinea and also Timor-Leste. So the annual state budget allocation for infrastructure has massively increased since 2014. And then the budget allocations is actually increased for the government, but it is not only the government that is expected to finance the infrastructure projects. So a larger proportions is actually expected from the state-owned enterprises, the private sectors, and also other source of financing. And apart from this, as a consequence of the infrastructure developments, tourism development has also accelerated, especially outside Java. And tourism, as I mentioned, is one of the main priorities of Indonesian economic policy. And then, as I mentioned before, Indonesia was dependent on commodities, but recently the government promoted and prioritizing downstream industry development. So processing commodities and banning the of exporting raw materials like nickel, crude palm oil, coconut, rubber, copper, coal. So instead, the downstream industry or the processing industry has been developed to reach the production of the downstream or more higher value added products like electric vehicles and also many others like non-renewable energy, etc. So yeah, and then in terms of energy, it is also important to mention that Indonesia is trying to reduce its dependence on oil consumptions by promoting and boosting the development of biodiesels. And so there has been a biodiesel mandatory program. And an important part of this policy is, utilizing the palm oil, because the palm oil can be used as a to mix as some energy mix with the fossil fuels to become the so-called biodiesel. And the Indonesian government during this administration has also introduced the so-called village funds. The idea of these village funds is actually to distribute the economic economic benefits, not just in urban areas, but also in rural areas, especially villages and the agricultural sectors. So the government allocated allocate 1 billion rupiah, or about 71,000 US dollars, for each village every year. So this is one of the new policy prioritizing the development of villages. And more recently, digital economy has been growing very fast as well in Indonesia, because there has been rapid growth of internet penetrations. There has been a massive growth of number of internet users, and as one of the results is actually Indonesia is now having 4 unicorns, global unicorns, that a company that has reached the value of over 1 billion US dollars. Okay, so that's the main part. So now we have move on to we will move on to the last part, which is the key challenges ahead. So despite those achievements that I have mentioned before, Indonesia is still facing quite a number of challenges ahead. The first one is how to distribute the economy to regions, especially the regions outside Java, because Java, the development has been concentrated in Java for so long. Yeah, so that's why the challenge is how to accelerate the development of the outer islands outside Java. In the last 20 years, there has not much change in terms of the composition or the share of regional economy if we compare Java and South Java. So Java still contributes about 58% of the national economy. So there's not much change in the last 20 years from 2000 to 2020. So that's why that's one the main reason. One of the main reasons now the government introduce or initiate the movement or the relocation of the capital. So there's been a new capital project initiated in the last, I think, 5 years, in the past 5 years or so. And the target of completion of this new capital project is the initial relocations is next year, 2024. So the capital is currently being has been planned to move from Jakarta, relocate from Jakarta to East Kalimantan. Especially there's a new place, a new area, cleared to become new capital, which is called Nusantara. This is located in East Kalimantan. And another challenge is still income disparity, because income disparity in Indonesia is still large. The gap between the rich and the poor is still very wide. And if we look at the Gini ratio here as a comparison, Indonesia and Pakistan, so the Indonesia's Gini ratio is still a much wider, much higher compared to Pakistan. So Pakistan's is actually more or less quite more equal in terms of economic distributions. Indonesia is having quite large gap in terms of economic disparity between the rich and the poor. And another issue is also there has been still rapid urbanizations, which is followed with increased urban informal sector. So since the past 10 years, since 2013, there has been more people live in urban areas compared with the rural areas. And that has led to increase of urban informal sectors. So informal sectors in urban areas, because the government has difficulties to provide or to create formal job opportunities for people, especially those who have moved to urban areas. And another challenge is how to accelerate industrializations, because Indonesia has been experiencing since the last 15 years or even more or even longer than that, the so-called early deindustrializations, meaning that the growth of the manufacturing sector is so slow, and even slower than the overall GDP growth. So that's also one of the reasons why the government is currently prioritizing to build the downstream industry, which is called the hilirisasi in Indonesia. And the downstream industry development has been prioritizing or accelerating right now, focusing on the mineral sector, like nickel, for example. Okay, and I think this is the last point, which is one of the key challenges ahead. Is also we're still facing the problem of resource exploitation. So there has been massive deforestation, especially in the outer island outside Java. So this picture is the picture of the Borneo Island, which used to be, if you look at the picture in the 1950s, is mainly covered by tropical forests. But then, from time to time, from year to year, 1985, 2000, as you can see here, there has been massive deforestations. So now, recently, the picture in 2020, if you look at the picture there, there's only the larger area of Borneo Island currently is not tropical forest anymore. So, and this massive resource exploitations has strong correlations with rent seeking, not only at the central level, but also at the local level, in line with the decentralizations as that I have mentioned earlier. So that's basically my presentation today. So thank you very much. I'm giving over to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, if anyone has any question, please you can ask. Yes, Faisal, please.
Assalamualaikum. First of all, thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful lecture. It was very informative. I do have some questions. The first is, how did IMF interventions affect the domestic conditions? Because we see that the domestic conditions are very much affected in Pakistan whenever there's IMF intervention. And the other question is that in current times, is Indonesia more tilted towards US or China? Because the ongoing CPEC project, most of the countries are tilting towards China now because that has become an emerging economy and they see more scope over there. So these are my two questions, and if you could answer them.
Okay, thank you for the questions. It's very interesting. So the first question is from Faiza. Sorry, Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So Faiza, the first question is about the IMF intervention on domestic economy. So yeah, so that's true. So the problem is that during that time we have a large fiscal deficit, and we are experiencing a very a terrible crisis that we have in 1998. So the government has no money to make the economy recover. So that's why the Suharto government back then had to ask for assistance from the IMF, and the IMF has requirements or recipe to give the Indonesian government's money for to relief from the crisis. So this recipe does not actually in one part is actually it helps it helps the economy to recover, and also the systems. For example, the centralized and an authoritarian regime, and then change into decentralized. So there has been a growing a power, a regional power, meaning that the local and regional government has their own voice, to the authority to decide and to direct the development in the regions. But at the same time, these so-called decentralizations also facing difficulties in terms of how to orchestrate the development between one region to another, and how to avoid, for example, the act of corrupt practices, that used to be, dominated by the central governments to local governments. And in fact, during the early period of the reform era, one of the problems actually the corrupt and cronyism was actually decentralized as well, in the regions, in many districts in Indonesia. But then again, the Corruption Eradication Commission was established in 2004, and that helps a lot in terms of to gain public trust on the government, the government programs or the government policy. So that's very important. But another example of the IMF interventions is that is worth to mention is actually liberalizations. So liberalizations was forced to Indonesia in the early import tariff, for example, be very low. So that has made Indonesia Indonesian import tariff is one of the lowest amongst the developing countries, apart from Singapore as well, of course. So because of this, the growth of industrialization also has been slowing down, because many of the Indonesian industry is still dependent on import tariff, because they're not competitive yet, for example, to compete, for example, with many other industrializing countries, like, for example, China. So there are many Chinese products have entered Indonesian markets since 2004. So at the same time, the consumers in Indonesia can enjoy cheaper products, but the products is from China, and many of the products are from China, and Indonesian manufacturing industry has had difficulties to compete with the Chinese manufacturing products. So that's the positive and negative impacts of the IMF interventions. Just some of the examples that I want to mention. And then your second question is about the relationships or how Indonesia interact with major power like the US and also China. Yeah. Is that true?
Yes, sir. I was
Yeah.
asking that is Indonesia more tilted towards the China or US, because Pakistan is more tilted towards China, sometimes it's towards US. So what is the stance of Indonesia? Are they more reliant on US or China?
Yeah. Well, the basic, I think, foreign relations policy in Indonesia is still free and active. So Indonesia needs to be independent, but at the same time, it's also active. But it is also true that the relationship with China is increasing, and especially economically. So China has become Indonesian major trading partner, major the largest origin of imports, and also the largest destination of Indonesian exports. Apart from that, the Chinese investments in Indonesia is also skyrocketing, not just in infrastructure, but also in other sectors. So economically, it becomes stronger at the same time, but also Indonesia used to be very close economically with Japan, but right now Japan is quite declining in trade and also in investments. But I can see that it is not just the case in Indonesia, but also in many countries, in many Asian countries, and also in Africa. There is an increased role of China in the world's economy. So right now you can see, well, we interact with China more. We talk about trade and investments, but at the same time, in terms of politics, that the stronger relations in economically also, of course, will affect politics. But once again, Indonesia is still politically free and active, and Indonesia is still, I think, currently still maintain and sustain its role as the big brother of ASEAN, and which means that Indonesia also have to sustain its neutrality and centrality in ASEAN. So that's why, for example, in the last G20 forum, for example, that was held last year, where Indonesia hosts the G20 forum, there is a conflict, especially the Russian war with Ukraine. That was one of the main discussions during the forum. And then there's some voice also from the Western countries and also from China, but Indonesia is still trying to to orchestrate and to stay neutral in this case. So so that's, I think, basically my view with relations to Indonesian relations with China. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. That answers all the questions.
Yes, Soha, now you can ask your question.
Assalamualaikum, sir. Hope you're doing well. Sir, I have two questions related to the topic. Question is, what role did international trade and foreign investment play in Indonesian recovery from the crisis? And my second question is, did the crisis lead to any significant changes in economic policy, regulation, or governance in Indonesia?
So what was your first questions regarding foreign investment?
So my first question was, what role did international trade and foreign investment play in Indonesian recovery from the crisis?
Okay, from the recent crisis. Yeah, I think
Yes.
in terms of trade and foreign investments, the role of Indonesia is right now. Indonesia is one of the G20 countries. At the same time, Indonesia is also a developing countries. So I think the role of Indonesia is actually how to voice or how to represent the developing countries in, you know, influencing the global economic order, including in trade and foreign investments. So, for example, one of the main topics that has been discussed during the G20 forum, I mentioned again the G20 forum recently, is how to recover from the crisis. And one of the issues is also how to finance the recovery. But at the same time, there's also a large pressure for from the developed countries to liberalize the economy, to really liberalize the trade. But at some point, a few developing countries like Indonesia that wants to industrialize themselves in order to, you know, to advance economically and as such also to better and more sustainably finance the economic recovery from the crisis. We also need to build our manufacturing industries. And as such, for example, as an important part of the policy, we need to build the downstream industry. And one of the important, the key success for the development of downstream industry is banning the raw material exports. So Indonesia used to export many raw materials such as mining, for example, nickel ore, copper, etc. Now, if we want to build or want to process these raw materials into a more higher value-added products, we need to ban the exports of this nickel ore. But internationally, well, this policy is deemed or seen as something against the liberalizations. So that is the thing. Actually, at some point, Indonesia, that represents the developing countries, has to say that Indonesia or developing countries have to have their own voice or definitions, and also in terms of how to recover from the policy, and how to actually to, well, to have their own authority, you know, to use the natural resources and to build the manufacturing industry, regardless of the global forces, the international force to liberalize the economy. So the point is actually many developing countries like Indonesia also need some sort of rethinking of what we can do to recover from the policy, and some of the things that we think is important might not, you know, might not always, you know, in line with what has been forced or what has been implemented in the global order, especially in terms of the thoughts that was dominated by the developed countries. Yeah, so that's basically it from me.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Vijiha, now it's your turn.
Assalamualaikum, sir. As you said that one of the challenges for India is, Indonesia is early deindustrialization. Do you think that being a part of
Vijay, you're not audible.
am I audible now?
Yes,
Yes.
that's
you
better.
are.
Okay, sorry. So as you said that the challenges for Indonesia is early deindustrialization. So do you think that being a part of China's Belt and Road Initiative can help Indonesia boost its downstream industry, the nickel part, as well as decrease the income disparity in the country?
Yeah. So okay, the Belt and Road. Well, Indonesia actually has been involved or accept the some of the projects of the Belt and Road initiatives since, if I'm not mistaken, since 2015. So there has been, if I'm not mistaken, over about well, less than 100, but over 10 projects that has been financed by China in Indonesia as part of the Belt and Road initiatives. Some of them is infrastructure projects, but some of them are not related to infrastructure projects. So, by definitions, the Belt and Road initiatives has something to do with, you know, to make the trade, you know, a trade flow more efficient, quicker. So it has something to do with, well, infrastructure projects, basically. But the Chinese investments in Indonesia are not all the infrastructure projects, but those which is infrastructure projects, actually, one of them is the development of high-speed railway. And this railway and this infrastructure project, well, typically it doesn't have anything to do with logistics. It is more building infrastructure in the land, doesn't have anything to do with make the sea transportation more efficient. So it has something to do with to make people's mobility from Jakarta to Bandung quicker and easier. But what about the logistics? So in this case, I think if we look at this particular example, there's not necessarily strong connections between the idea of the Belt and Road initiatives and the needs for Indonesia to improve its logistics performance. And well, in fact, recently, if I'm not mistaken, the World Bank has released the last logistics performance index in 2023, and the logistic performance in Indonesia is assessed lower than that in 2018, 5 years ago. And one of the variables that has been declining is actually international shipping. So if we talk about how to improve the logistical performance, which is also one of the Indonesian government's priorities in building infrastructure, is actually we have to really focus on that. So at this stage, the Belt and Road initiatives does not have anything to do with improving the logistics. Yeah. So, but there are also some other projects which is not the infrastructure projects. I think, for example, sorry, still infrastructure project, but not that doesn't have to do with transportation. For example, the building of a few dams in Indonesia, and some of these dam projects, development project was financed by the Chinese investors. And the dam is really important for Indonesia because we need to build more dam to irrigate our agricultural land. So in this case, I think the development of dam financed by the Chinese investments, I think important to help the farmers to improve the productivity. Yeah. So the only thing is actually how to then distribute or to replicate these projects, not just in Java, for example, but also in outer islands, in other regions outside Java, because we also need to build several central of food productions, and do not only focus on or concentrate it only in Java. So yeah, so that's basically it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Mohammed, now it's your turn. You can ask.
So first of all, good afternoon, and thank you so much for presenting. I just have a small question, more related to business perspective, that how government is encouraging or supporting small or medium enterprises to play a significant role in economy, and how it will foster innovation and supporting entrepreneurship for enhancing economic connectivity and creating job opportunities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the questions, Mohammed. Small and medium enterprises is actually the biggest part of Indonesia. Some of the economists also even mentioned that it's the backbone of the Indonesian economy, because over 90% or even over 97% of Indonesian entrepreneurs is actually small and medium. Small and micro. So micro is the largest part of it. Many strategies and programs to improve the competitiveness and also productivity of small and micro firms is very important. And then, but the thing is that it is not something that can be solved only by, for example, by providing money or providing access to, for example, bank credits only. Because the problem actually for, especially for micro firms, it's not just about how to get access for financing or money, but also how to actually to become more competitive, meaning that the program has to be more comprehensive, starting from how to start the business itself, including how to get access to money. But apart from that, is also how to improve the management and how to make, for example, a more attractive, more marketable products by these micro firms, and meaning that there is a need to technical assistance for the small firms. Apart from that, which is also very important, is how to improve or expands the access to markets. And this is particularly important, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. We had several surveys after the COVID-19 pandemics asking the small and micro firms what are actually their biggest challenge or biggest problems that needs to be solved. So the top answer, the number one answer, is always access to market, because the demands has been declining sharply. So if we talk about about how to improve their productivity, it's really number one is how to improve the access, the market access. So it means that it is not only about how the technical problems of in terms of management, in terms of financing. It also has something to do with the trade policy, because first of all is domestic market, because small and micro firms normally they are dependent on domestic markets, and Indonesian domestic markets are huge. So the trade policy domestically is also very important to prioritize or to make easier for small and micro firms to access the huge domestic markets. And apart from then we have to also consider the foreign or overseas markets. This is the next step. So I think the first step is actually how to make sure that the big domestic market can be accessed easily by the small and micro firms. So it is the government has several programs already, but I think the important thing is how to integrate from one policy to another, and also to make sure that it's it is not only about how to achieve the outputs of each of the single different projects or programs, but what is actually the outcome. The outcome is actually the final outcome, which is how many small and micro firms have been assisted and have been more competitive and have been upgraded from micro to small, from small to medium, from, for example, from the local market to regional markets, still domestic, but then also to overseas market. So yeah, so that's basically my answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. It was very insightful and informative session, and we are fortunate to have had the opportunity to learn from your wealth of knowledge and experience. So once again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you as a guest today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.